October 15, 1999 began like any other autumn morning in the small town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania. The maple trees that lined Sycamore Street had transformed into a canopy of amber and crimson, their leaves drifting lazily onto well-maintained lawns where jack-o'-lanterns sat grinning from front porches. The air carried that distinctive scent of wood smoke and apple cider that seemed to define small-town America in the weeks before Halloween. Children's laughter echoed from backyards where parents raked leaves into towering piles, only to watch their efforts scattered by gleeful jumps and tumbles. At 847 Sycamore Street, 7-year-old Emma Catherine Morrison was doing what she did every morning, sitting cross-legged on her bedroom floor, carefully arranging her collection of toy horses in a perfect semicircle. Her dark hair fell in gentle waves around her shoulders, and her green eyes, the same shade as her mother's, held that particular intensity that children possess when they're completely absorbed in their imaginary worlds. Emma had names for each horse: Thunder, Star, Moonbeam, and her absolute favorite, a Palomino mare she'd christened Buttercup. The toy had been a gift from her Uncle David on her 6th birthday, and she rarely went anywhere without it clutched in her small hands. "Emma, breakfast," her mother Sarah called from downstairs, her voice carrying the familiar morning rush of a working parent. Sarah Morrison worked as a nurse at Millbrook General Hospital, and though she loved her job, the early shifts meant their mornings together were precious and brief. She stood in the kitchen, scrambling eggs while simultaneously packing Emma's lunch, a peanut butter and jelly sandwich cut into triangles, apple slices, and a juice box. The kitchen window overlooked their backyard, where Emma's swing set stood beneath an old oak tree, its chains creaking softly in the October breeze. Emma's father, Michael Morrison, sat at the breakfast table reading the morning paper, his coffee growing cold as he scanned the sports section. He was a quiet man who worked at the local hardware store, the kind of person who knew everyone in town by name and could fix anything that broke. His relationship with Emma was built on small moments, teaching her to ride her bike, helping her build blanket forts, and reading bedtime stories with voices for every character. He looked up as Emma padded into the kitchen, her bare feet silent on the linoleum floor, still clutching Buttercup. "Morning, sunshine," he said, folding the paper and giving her his full attention. Emma climbed onto her chair, placing Buttercup carefully beside her cereal bowl. Sarah ruffled her daughter's hair as she set the scrambled eggs on the table, noting how Emma's school uniform, a navy jumper over a white blouse, was already slightly wrinkled from her morning play. "Mrs. Henderson wants us to bring something for the Halloween party next week," Emma announced, taking a small bite of her eggs. "Can we make those orange cookies with the black frosting, the ones that look like pumpkins?" Sarah and Michael exchanged a smile over their daughter's head. Emma had been talking about the Halloween party for weeks, planning her costume, a princess naturally, and discussing which friends would be there. "Of course we can," Sarah replied, glancing at the clock on the microwave. "But right now, we need to get you ready for school. Uncle David is picking you up today, remember?" Emma's face lit up at the mention of her uncle. David Morrison was Michael's younger brother, unmarried at 32, who worked as a mechanic at the garage on Main Street. He had always been good with Emma, patient and playful in a way that made him her favorite relative after her parents. Emma finished her breakfast quickly, her excitement about spending the afternoon with Uncle David evident in the way she bounced slightly in her chair. After school, the plan was for David to pick her up and take her to his house for a few hours, while Sarah worked a double shift at the hospital. It was an arrangement they'd made several times before, and Emma always returned home full of stories about the games they'd played or the places they'd gone. Sarah walked Emma to the front door, helping her into her pink backpack and making sure she had her lunch money. The school bus would arrive in exactly 12 minutes. Sarah had timed it countless mornings. She knelt down to Emma's level, smoothing her hair one final time and straightening her collar. "Be good for Uncle David, okay? And remember, he'll pick you up right after school." "I know, Mommy," Emma said, then surprised her mother by throwing her arms around her neck in an extra tight hug. "I love you." Sarah held her daughter close, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo, and feeling that particular mother's love that was both fierce and tender. If she had known this would be their last morning together, would she have held on longer? The question would haunt her for decades. The yellow school bus rounded the corner right on schedule, its brakes hissing as it stopped in front of the Morrison house. Emma grabbed her backpack and headed toward the door, but then turned back suddenly. "Mommy, can Buttercup come to school with me today?" Sarah glanced at the toy horse, noting how worn it was becoming from constant handling. The school had a policy against toys, but something in Emma's expression made her hesitate. "Just this once," Sarah said, "but keep her in your backpack, okay?" Emma nodded solemnly, tucking Buttercup into the front pocket of her bag. She kissed her mother goodbye and ran toward the bus, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders. Sarah watched from the doorway as Emma climbed the steps, turned to wave one final time, and disappeared into the yellow interior. The bus pulled away with a mechanical groan, carrying Emma toward what would be her last day at Millbrook Elementary. If stories like this move you, you might want to subscribe. We explore the mysteries that change ordinary families forever. At school, Emma's teacher, Mrs. Patterson, would later remember that she seemed particularly excited that day. During show and tell, Emma had secretly shown Buttercup to her best friend, Jenny Rodriguez, whispering about how Uncle David had promised to take her to the pet store to look at real ponies. Mrs. Patterson recalled Emma's bright smile during math class, the way she'd raised her hand eagerly to answer questions, and how she'd eaten every bite of her lunch while chattering about Halloween plans. The final bell rang at 3:15 p.m., and children poured out of the building like water through a dam. Emma waited by the flagpole, just as she'd been instructed, her eyes scanning the line of cars and parents for Uncle David's familiar pickup truck. Other children were claimed by their families, hugs and kisses exchanged, backpacks thrown into car seats. Emma stood patiently, occasionally adjusting her backpack straps and humming softly to herself. Mrs. Patterson was locking up her classroom when she noticed Emma still waiting by the flagpole. "Emma, honey, is someone coming to get you?" she asked, walking over with her own purse and the stack of papers she'd be grading that evening. Emma nodded confidently. "Uncle David, he's probably just running late." Mrs. Patterson stayed with her for another 10 minutes, making small talk about the upcoming Halloween party and complimenting Emma's neat handwriting from that day's assignment. At 3:45 p.m., David Morrison's blue pickup truck pulled into the school parking lot. Mrs. Patterson waved goodbye as Emma ran toward the vehicle, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders. Through the passenger window, she could see David smiling and talking to Emma as she climbed into the truck. The last anyone saw of Emma Catherine Morrison was her small hand waving from the passenger seat as the blue pickup disappeared down Maple Avenue. That evening, when Sarah Morrison returned from her double shift at the hospital, she expected to find Emma already home, probably in her pajamas and full of stories about her afternoon with Uncle David. Instead, she found her husband Michael sitting at the kitchen table, his face pale and his hands shaking slightly as he held the telephone. David had called at 6 p.m., his voice tight with panic, saying that Emma had never shown up at the school. He'd waited until 4 p.m., then driven around the neighborhood thinking perhaps there had been some confusion about the pickup location. The next few hours passed in a blur of frantic phone calls and mounting dread. Sarah called the school, but it was after hours and no one answered. Michael drove to David's house, then to the school, then back home, hoping against hope that Emma would be there waiting for them. By 9 p.m., when there was still no sign of their daughter, they called the police. Officer Janet Hayes, who had known the Morrison family for years, arrived within minutes and began asking the questions that would echo through the investigation for months to come. The last confirmed sighting of Emma Morrison was at 3:45 p.m. on October 15, 1999, climbing into her Uncle David's pickup truck outside Millbrook Elementary School. What happened in the 43 minutes between her disappearance and David's panicked phone call would remain a mystery for 23 years, until a broken toy in an attic would finally reveal the truth that no one wanted to believe. The Millbrook Police Department had never handled a missing child case. In a town of 8,000 people, where the most serious crimes were typically vandalism at the high school or the occasional drunk driving incident, the disappearance of Emma Morrison sent shockwaves through the community that would reverberate for decades. Chief Robert Martinez, a 30-year veteran of law enforcement who had moved to Millbrook specifically for its quiet pace, found himself coordinating a search effort that would test every resource his small department possessed. Within hours of Sarah and Michael Morrison's 911 call, Emma's face was everywhere. Her school photo, the one taken just 3 weeks earlier, showing her gap-toothed smile and bright green eyes, was photocopied and distributed to every business in town. The local radio station interrupted regular programming to broadcast her description every 15 minutes. By midnight, volunteer search teams were forming in the parking lot of the community center, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they prepared to comb through the woods and fields surrounding Millbrook. David Morrison sat in the police station's small interrogation room, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Detective Lisa Chen, brought in from the county sheriff's office to assist with the investigation, studied him carefully as he recounted his version of events for the 4th time. David was a slight man with thinning brown hair and nervous habits. He tapped his fingers constantly and had trouble maintaining eye contact. He worked as a mechanic at Jerry's auto shop, lived alone in a small apartment above the hardware store, and had never married, though he'd dated sporadically over the years. "Tell me again about yesterday afternoon," Detective Chen said, her voice gentle but persistent. David rubbed his eyes, which were red-rimmed from exhaustion and what appeared to be genuine distress. "I got to the school around 3:45. I was running late because we had a car that wouldn't start at the shop, and I had to stay to help Jerry figure out the problem. When I got there, Emma wasn't at the flagpole where she usually waited." "Did you see her teacher? Any other school staff?" Chen asked, taking notes in her careful handwriting. David shook his head. "The parking lot was mostly empty. I figured maybe Emma went inside to use the bathroom or something, so I waited in the truck. After about 15 minutes, I got out and walked around the building, but I didn't see her anywhere. I thought maybe Sarah had changed her mind and picked Emma up herself." The story had remained consistent through multiple tellings, and David's alibi for the time before he arrived at the school had been verified by his employer. Jerry Kowalski confirmed that David had been at the garage until 3:30 p.m., working on a customer's transmission. The drive from the garage to the school was exactly 12 minutes, which meant David could not have been at the school when Emma was last seen climbing into the blue pickup truck. But there was a problem with David's story, one that Detective Chen had noticed immediately, but hadn't yet addressed directly. Mrs. Patterson, Emma's teacher, had clearly seen the child get into a blue pickup truck at 3:45 p.m. She'd watched Emma run toward the vehicle, seen her climb into the passenger seat, and witnessed the truck driving away. David Morrison drove a blue pickup truck, and Mrs. Patterson had initially assumed it was him. But if David's alibi was solid, then whose truck had Emma gotten into? The investigation expanded rapidly. Every blue pickup truck in Millbrook and the surrounding counties was located and examined. The state police brought in specialized units trained in child abduction cases. The FBI opened a file and sent agents to coordinate with local law enforcement. Phone records were subpoenaed, backgrounds checked, and polygraph tests administered. David Morrison passed his polygraph exam, as did Michael and Sarah Morrison, though the test results would remain unofficial and inadmissible in court. Search teams scoured the dense woods that surrounded Millbrook, working in grid patterns and calling Emma's name until their voices grew hoarse. Local businesses closed early so their employees could join the search. The high school cancelled classes and organized student volunteers. Church groups provided meals for the searchers, and the local newspaper ran Emma's photo on the front page with the headline, "Help Find Emma Morrison." The town's sense of security had been shattered, and parents began walking their children to school and keeping them inside after dark. As the days passed without any sign of Emma, the investigation began to focus on the Morrison family itself. Statistics showed that in cases of missing children, family members were responsible for the disappearance more than 60% of the time. Detective Chen interviewed neighbors, teachers, and family friends, building a picture of the Morrison household and looking for any signs of dysfunction or abuse. What she found was a family that seemed remarkably normal and loving. Emma's pediatrician, Dr. Susan Walsh, reported that the child had never shown any signs of physical abuse or neglect. Her school records indicated she was a bright, well-adjusted student with no behavioral problems. Teachers described her as happy and talkative, always eager to share stories about her family's weekend activities or vacation plans. Neighbors spoke of seeing Emma playing in the yard with her parents or walking to the corner store with her mother to buy ice cream on summer evenings. The financial investigation revealed no unusual stresses or suspicious activities. Michael Morrison earned a modest but steady income at the hardware store, and Sarah's nursing salary provided additional stability. They owned their home, had a small savings account, and lived within their means. There were no large insurance policies on Emma, no recent life changes that might indicate planning for a disappearance, and no evidence of gambling debts or other financial pressures that might motivate desperate actions. But the most puzzling aspect of the case remained the blue pickup truck. Mrs. Patterson was certain about what she'd seen, and her description of the vehicle matched David Morrison's truck exactly. Yet David's alibi was ironclad, verified by multiple witnesses and security camera footage from the garage. The logical explanation was that Emma had gotten into someone else's blue pickup truck, but that raised the terrifying possibility that she had been taken by a stranger or by someone she knew and trusted enough to approach willingly. The investigation expanded to include all of Emma's relatives, family, friends, and anyone who had regular contact with the Morrison family. Background checks revealed nothing suspicious about David Morrison beyond a few traffic tickets and a minor arrest for underage drinking in college. He had no criminal record, no history of inappropriate behavior with children, and no known psychological problems. His apartment was searched with his permission, and investigators found nothing unusual, just the modest possessions of a bachelor who worked with his hands and lived quietly. 3 weeks after Emma's disappearance, the case was featured on the television show America's Most Wanted. The segment showed Emma's school photo, described the circumstances of her disappearance, and included a dramatic recreation of the final moments when she was seen climbing into the blue pickup truck. The show generated hundreds of tips from across the country, each one carefully investigated and ultimately ruled out. There were reported sightings of Emma in shopping malls, at truck stops, and in small towns hundreds of miles from Millbrook, but none of them led to any concrete evidence. The Morrison family struggled to maintain hope as the investigation continued. Sarah took a leave of absence from her job at the hospital, unable to concentrate on her patients while her own daughter was missing. Michael continued working at the hardware store, but his co-workers noticed that he seemed to age years in just weeks, his hair growing grayer and his movements becoming slower and more deliberate. They rarely slept through the night, and when they did, they were often awakened by dreams of Emma calling for them. The media attention brought both help and additional pain. Reporters from newspapers and television stations descended on Millbrook, interviewing anyone who would speak to them about the Morrison family and the ongoing investigation. Well-meaning but misguided psychics called the police department claiming to have visions of Emma's location. True crime enthusiasts analyzed every detail of the case on internet forums, sometimes spreading misinformation or cruel speculation about the family's involvement. As autumn turned to winter, the daily searches became less frequent, though they never stopped entirely. The FBI agents returned to their field office, leaving behind a case file that would remain open indefinitely. Detective Chen continued working the case, following up on tips and re-interviewing witnesses, but she privately began to fear that Emma Morrison had become another statistic, one of the thousands of children who disappear each year without a trace. Christmas 1999 was the most difficult day in the Morrison family's life. Sarah had bought Emma's gifts weeks before the disappearance, and they remained wrapped under the tree, along with the stocking that hung empty beside those of her parents. The community rallied around the family, organizing a Christmas dinner and ensuring they weren't alone during the holidays, but nothing could fill the Emma-shaped void in their lives. The case file grew thicker with each passing month, filled with witness statements, photographs, timeline reconstructions, and forensic reports. But despite the thousands of hours invested in the investigation, despite the expertise of federal agents and the dedication of local police, despite the prayers and hopes of an entire community, Emma Morrison had simply vanished as if she had never existed at all. The only physical evidence of her disappearance was the absence itself: an empty bedroom, a school desk that remained vacant, and a family forever changed by the mystery of what had happened during those 43 minutes on October 15, 1999. The Morrison house on Sycamore Street became a monument to suspended time. In the months following Emma's disappearance, Sarah found herself unable to change anything in her daughter's room. The bed remained unmade, exactly as Emma had left it that final morning. The toy horses still sat in their careful semicircle on the floor, though dust had begun to settle on their plastic manes. Emma's school clothes hung in the closet, her winter coat still draped over the chair where she'd carelessly tossed it the evening before she vanished. Michael tried to maintain normalcy, returning to work at the hardware store and attempting to establish routines that might help them both heal. But customers would approach him with gentle questions about the investigation, offering support that felt both genuine and overwhelming. Mrs. Henderson from the grocery store would pat his arm and ask if there was any news. The mailman would inquire about Sarah's health. Well-meaning neighbors would share stories about their own children, perhaps hoping to remind him that life continued even in the face of unimaginable loss. The relationship between the Morrison brothers became strained in ways that no one could have predicted. David visited frequently in the early weeks, bringing groceries and helping with household tasks that Sarah and Michael seemed unable to manage. But as the investigation intensified and questions about his whereabouts on October 15th became more persistent, his presence in their home began to feel complicated. He was both a source of comfort and a painful reminder of the day Emma disappeared. Sarah's grief manifested in obsessive behaviors that worried her husband and her doctors. She would spend hours studying Emma's school photos, memorizing every detail of her daughter's face as if afraid she might forget. She called the police station daily, asking Detective Chen if there were any updates, any new leads, any reason for hope. She organized her own search parties, driving through nearby towns and stopping at gas stations to show Emma's photo to clerks and customers. The couple's marriage, which had been strong before Emma's disappearance, began to show signs of strain under the weight of their shared but differently expressed grief. Michael wanted to focus on moving forward, on finding ways to honor Emma's memory while continuing to live. Sarah seemed unable to accept that Emma might not be coming home, and she interpreted any attempt at normalcy as a betrayal of their daughter's memory. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a grief counselor brought in by the Victims Services Program, worked with the Morrison family through the difficult first year. She helped them understand that their different approaches to mourning were both valid and normal. Sarah's need to maintain Emma's room as a shrine reflected her desire to keep her daughter's presence alive in their home. Michael's impulse to gradually resume normal activities was his way of preventing the disappearance from destroying what remained of their family. The anniversary of Emma's disappearance became an annual ritual of renewed hope and crushing disappointment. Each October 15th, Detective Chen would call the Morrison family to let them know that the case remained active, that new tips were still being investigated, and that Emma had not been forgotten by law enforcement. The local newspaper would run a follow-up article, updating the community on the status of the investigation and including recent photos of how Emma might look as she grew older. Sarah kept a journal during those first years, writing letters to Emma as if she might somehow read them. The entries began with desperate hope and gradually evolved into a more resigned acceptance that their daughter might never come home. She wrote about the changing seasons, about neighbors who had moved away, about holidays that felt hollow without Emma's laughter filling the house. The journal became a way for her to maintain a connection with her daughter while processing her own psychological survival. David Morrison struggled with his own form of survivor's guilt. He had been the last person to see Emma alive according to the official timeline, and he carried the burden of wondering if he had done something differently, arrived at the school earlier, called to confirm the pickup time, insisted on walking Emma to his truck instead of waiting for her to come to him. Might she still be alive? His relationship with his brother became increasingly distant as the years passed, not because of any direct accusation, but because his presence served as a constant reminder of the worst day in the Morrison family's life. The community of Millbrook gradually moved on, as communities do, but the Morrison family remained frozen in October 1999. New families moved into the neighborhood, and children who had been Emma's classmates graduated from high school and went to college. The teachers who had known Emma retired or transferred to other schools. The investigators who had worked on her case were promoted or moved to different assignments. But Sarah and Michael Morrison remained on Sycamore Street, in the same house, waiting for a resolution that seemed less likely with each passing year. Emma's disappearance had ripple effects throughout the extended Morrison family. Michael's parents, who lived in Florida, visited less frequently because the trips became too emotionally difficult for everyone involved. Sarah's sister, who had children of her own, struggled to maintain a relationship with her sister while protecting her own family from the overwhelming sadness that seemed to permeate every interaction with the Morrisons. The couple's social circle gradually diminished as well. Friends who had initially rallied around them with meals and emotional support found it increasingly difficult to maintain relationships with people who seemed unable to move beyond their grief. This wasn't callousness or lack of compassion. It was the natural result of two timelines moving at different speeds. While the rest of the world continued to change and grow, the Morrison family remained anchored to a single moment in time. Michael eventually received a promotion to assistant manager at the hardware store, a recognition of his steady work and long tenure with the company. Sarah returned to nursing part-time, finding that caring for other people's physical ailments provided a form of therapy that traditional counseling had never achieved. They established routines that worked around the empty space where Emma should have been, creating a life that was functional if not fully fulfilling. The investigation officially transitioned from active to cold case status after 5 years, though Detective Chen continued to follow up on occasional leads and tips. The case file had grown to several thick folders, containing witness statements, forensic reports, photographs and timelines that had been analyzed and reanalyzed countless times. The FBI maintained their file as well, and Emma's information was entered into national databases that would trigger alerts if she was ever found or identified. By 2009, 10 years after Emma's disappearance, the Morrison family had settled into a pattern of quiet endurance. They attended annual memorial services organized by the community, participated in missing children's awareness events, and maintained hope that someday they might learn what had happened to their daughter. But they had also learned to live with uncertainty, to find meaning in their daily routines, and to support each other through the waves of grief that would occasionally overwhelm them without warning. The bedroom at the end of the hall remained unchanged, a 7-year-old space preserved in amber. Sarah still dusted the toy horses regularly, though she had stopped arranging them in their original semicircle. Michael had suggested several times that they might convert the room into a guest bedroom or home office, but Sarah wasn't ready for such a permanent acknowledgement that Emma might never return. The room represented possibility. As long as it remained Emma's room, there was still a chance that she might someday walk through the front door and climb the stairs to her bed. As the years passed, the Morrison family learned to carry their grief rather than be consumed by it. They found ways to honor Emma's memory while continuing to live their own lives. But they never stopped wondering about those 43 minutes on October 15, 1999, and they never stopped hoping that someday, somehow, they might finally learn the truth about what had happened to their daughter. Detective Lisa Chen had worked hundreds of cases during her 20-year career in law enforcement, but the disappearance of Emma Morrison haunted her in ways that she struggled to articulate to her colleagues and family. There was something about the case that felt fundamentally different from the domestic disputes, burglaries, and even homicides that typically crossed her desk. Perhaps it was the age of the victim, or the complete absence of physical evidence, or the way the entire community had rallied around the Morrison family. Whatever the reason, Chen found herself thinking about Emma Morrison during her off-duty hours, reviewing case files at her kitchen table and following up on leads that other detectives might have considered too remote to pursue. The investigation had consumed tremendous resources in its first year. The Pennsylvania State Police had assigned a task force to the case, and the FBI had provided expertise in child abduction cases and behavioral analysis. Search teams had covered thousands of acres of forest and farmland surrounding Millbrook. Every registered sex offender within a 100-mile radius had been interviewed, and their whereabouts on October 15th verified. Phone records, financial records, and travel records had been analyzed for anyone who had contact with the Morrison family. But despite the intensive effort, the case had yielded frustratingly few concrete leads. The blue pickup truck remained the most promising piece of evidence, yet it had led investigators nowhere. Mrs. Patterson's description of the vehicle was detailed and consistent, but without a license plate number or other identifying features, it was impossible to locate. The truck had been described as mid-1990s vintage, in good condition, with no visible damage or distinctive markings. In a rural area where pickup trucks were common, this description matched hundreds of vehicles. The timeline of Emma's disappearance had been reconstructed with precision, but it only highlighted the mystery rather than solving it. Emma had been seen at school until 3:15 p.m. when classes ended. She had waited by the flagpole until 3:45 p.m. when Mrs. Patterson saw her climb into the blue pickup truck. David Morrison had called the Morrison house at 6:12 p.m. to report that Emma had never arrived at the school. The 43 minutes between Emma's disappearance and David's phone call remained a complete void in the investigation. David Morrison's alibi had been verified through multiple sources, but Detective Chen had continued to investigate him thoroughly. She had interviewed his co-workers, his neighbors, his ex-girlfriends, and anyone who had regular contact with him. The picture that emerged was of a quiet, somewhat solitary man who worked steadily, paid his bills on time, and had no history of inappropriate behavior with children. His apartment had been searched multiple times, and investigators had found nothing suspicious. The psychological profile developed by FBI behavioral analysts suggested that Emma's abductor was likely someone she knew and trusted, given that she had willingly approached the vehicle. The analysis indicated that the perpetrator was probably a local resident, familiar with Emma's school schedule and pickup routine. The profile suggested someone who appeared non-threatening, possibly middle-aged, and able to gain a child's trust quickly. But these characteristics could have applied to dozens of people in Millbrook and the surrounding area. As the investigation entered its second year, Detective Chen began to explore more unconventional theories. She investigated whether Emma might have been taken by someone involved in human trafficking, though the FBI's analysis suggested this was unlikely given the victim's age and the circumstances of the disappearance. She researched similar cases in other states, looking for patterns that might indicate a serial abductor, but found no matches that seemed relevant to Emma's case. The media attention, which had been intense in the first months after Emma's disappearance, gradually diminished as newer stories captured public interest. The case was featured on several television programs focused on missing children, and Emma's photo was distributed to law enforcement agencies across the country. But as leads dried up and months passed without significant developments, even the specialized media outlets moved on to more recent cases. Detective Chen established relationships with investigators in other jurisdictions who were working similar cases, sharing information and comparing notes about methods and patterns. She attended conferences on missing children investigations and maintained correspondence with experts in the field. But despite these efforts, no new information emerged that could advance the Morrison case. The physical evidence was minimal and frustratingly inconclusive. Emma's backpack had never been found, despite extensive searches of the area around the school and the routes that led away from Millbrook. Her clothes from that day, the navy jumper and white blouse, had been described in detail, and their photographs circulated widely, but no one had ever reported seeing them. The lack of physical evidence made it impossible to determine whether Emma had been taken to a remote location or had remained in the area. One of the most challenging aspects of the investigation was the phenomenon of false leads and mistaken sightings. The case had generated hundreds of tips from people who believed they had seen Emma in shopping malls, restaurants, or other public places. Each tip required investigation, even though the vast majority proved to be cases of mistaken identity or wishful thinking. Detective Chen had traveled to other states to interview witnesses and examine evidence, but none of these leads had produced credible information about Emma's whereabouts. The Morrison family's cooperation with the investigation had been complete and consistent, but Detective Chen had continued to scrutinize their activities and relationships. She had interviewed Emma's teachers, classmates, and friends, looking for any indication that the child had been worried about something or had mentioned being approached by strangers. She had examined the family's finances for any signs of unusual activity or stress that might indicate involvement in Emma's disappearance. But every line of inquiry had led to the same conclusion. The Morrison family appeared to be genuine victims of a tragic crime. As the case entered its third year, Detective Chen was forced to acknowledge that the investigation had reached a standstill. The initial leads had been exhausted, and new information was becoming increasingly rare. The case file had grown to enormous proportions, But despite the volume of documentation, investigators were no closer to solving the mystery than they had been in the first weeks after Emma's disappearance. The transition from active to cold case status was gradual and unofficial. Detective Chen continued to follow up on occasional tips and to review the case file periodically, but she was assigned to other investigations that required her immediate attention. The FBI closed their active investigation but maintained Emma's information in their databases. The Pennsylvania State Police reduced their involvement to periodic reviews and responses to new information. The Morrison family was notified of these changes, though they had already sensed the shift in the investigation's intensity. Detective Chen continued to call them monthly with updates, but increasingly, these calls were to report that there were no new developments. The family understood that the investigation was not being abandoned, but they also recognized that the chances of new information emerging were becoming smaller with each passing month. By 2005, 6 years after Emma's disappearance, Detective Chen had been promoted to sergeant and was supervising other detectives working on active cases. But she kept Emma's file in her desk drawer and continued to review it periodically, hoping that time might provide new perspective or that technological advances might offer new investigative possibilities. She had made a personal promise to the Morrison family that Emma would never be forgotten, and she intended to keep that promise regardless of her official duties. The case remained officially open, but everyone involved understood that barring new evidence or a confession, the mystery of Emma Morrison's disappearance would likely never be solved. The investigation had been thorough, professional, and exhaustive, but it had been defeated by the simple absence of information. Somewhere in those 43 minutes on October 15, 1999, Emma Morrison had vanished as completely as if she had never existed, leaving behind only questions that seemed destined to remain unanswered forever. The year 2019 marked the 20th anniversary of Emma Morrison's disappearance, and the milestone was observed with the quiet resignation that comes with accepting the unchangeable. Detective Lisa Chen, now Lieutenant Chen and nearing retirement, had kept her promise to never forget Emma Morrison. The case file, now housed in a special archive for cold cases, had grown to fill an entire filing cabinet. Every few months, Chen would pull out the familiar folders and review the evidence, hoping that time might reveal something that had been missed in the initial investigation. The Morrison family had changed in ways both subtle and profound. Sarah Morrison, now 47, had silver streaks in her dark hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of decades of worry and grief. She had returned to full-time nursing and had become a respected charge nurse at Millbrook General Hospital. Her colleagues knew about Emma, but they also knew that Sarah had built a life around her loss rather than letting it destroy her. She participated in hospital committees, mentored new nurses, and had even taken on teaching responsibilities at the local community college. Michael Morrison, at 51, had become the manager of the hardware store where he had worked for most of his adult life. He was known throughout Millbrook as a man who could fix anything and who treated his employees with fairness and respect. His hair had gone completely grey, and he moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to carry invisible weight. He had never remarried, though he had dated occasionally over the years. The relationships had been pleasant, but ultimately unsuccessful, perhaps because no one could compete with the memory of the family he had lost. The house on Sycamore Street had been updated in small ways over the years. The kitchen had been remodeled after a pipe burst in 2008, and the living room had been repainted several times. But Emma's bedroom remained essentially unchanged, a shrine to a 7-year-old girl who would have been 27 if she had lived to see 2019. David Morrison had moved away from Millbrook in 2003, unable to bear the weight of being forever associated with the worst day in his family's history. He had relocated to Pittsburgh, where he worked as a supervisor at a large automotive repair facility. His relationship with his brother Michael had never fully recovered from the strain of the investigation, though they maintained contact through holiday cards and occasional phone calls. David had married in 2007, but the marriage had ended in divorce 3 years later. His ex-wife later told friends that David seemed to carry a sadness that she could never understand or alleviate. The community of Millbrook had grown and changed over the 2 decades. New housing developments had been built on the outskirts of town, bringing young families who had never heard of Emma Morrison. The elementary school had been renovated and expanded, and most of the teachers who had known Emma had retired or moved to other districts. Mrs. Patterson, Emma's teacher from 1999, had retired in 2010 and moved to Florida to be closer to her grandchildren. But before she left, she had visited Sarah Morrison to share her memories of Emma and to promise that she would never forget the bright little girl who had loved to raise her hand in class. Lieutenant Chen had begun the process of digitizing the Morrison case file, scanning thousands of pages of documents and entering them into modern databases that could cross-reference information in ways that weren't possible in 1999. She had also submitted DNA samples collected during the original investigation to newer databases that might reveal matches with other cases or with individuals who'd been arrested in the intervening years. But despite the technological advances, no new information had emerged. The missing children landscape had changed dramatically since 1999. The internet had created new dangers for children, but it had also revolutionized the way missing children cases were investigated and publicized. Emma's photo had been added to numerous websites dedicated to missing persons, and her case had been featured in online forums where amateur investigators discussed cold cases. Some of these discussions had generated new theories about what might have happened to Emma, but none had produced credible leads. Sarah Morrison had become involved with several organizations dedicated to helping families of missing children. She attended annual conferences where she met other parents who understood her experience in ways that even close friends could not. These relationships had been both healing and heartbreaking. Healing because they provided a community of people who truly understood her loss, and heartbreaking because they reminded her of how many families were living with similar pain. The psychological impact of Emma's disappearance had evolved over the years. The acute grief of the early years had gradually transformed into a chronic ache that was manageable but ever-present. Sarah and Michael had learned to live with uncertainty, to find meaning in their daily routines, and to support each other through the waves of renewed grief that would occasionally overwhelm them without warning. They had also learned to find joy in small things: a beautiful sunset, a neighbor's kindness, the satisfaction of work well done. The 20th anniversary of Emma's disappearance was marked by a small memorial service at the community center. About 50 people attended, including some of Emma's former classmates, who were now adults with children of their own. Lieutenant Chen spoke about the ongoing commitment to finding answers, though everyone in attendance understood that after 20 years, the chances of new developments were minimal. Sarah Morrison read a letter she had written to Emma, expressing her love and her continued hope that someday they might be reunited. The media coverage of the anniversary was minimal: a brief article in the local newspaper and a segment on the regional television news. The case had lost its power to capture public attention, competing with more recent tragedies and mysteries. But for those who had known Emma, who had loved her, who had searched for her, the anniversary served as a reminder that some questions remain unanswered, and some wounds never fully heal. In her private moments, Sarah Morrison often wondered what Emma would have been like as an adult. Would she have inherited her father's quiet strength or her mother's determination? Would she have become a teacher, a nurse, or perhaps pursued a career that her parents couldn't even imagine? Would she have married and had children of her own? These questions were both comforting and torturous. Comforting because they allowed Sarah to maintain a connection with her daughter, torturous because they emphasized everything that had been lost. Michael Morrison had developed his own way of honoring Emma's memory. He had established a small scholarship fund at the elementary school for students who showed kindness to others, reasoning that Emma's caring nature had been one of her most distinctive qualities. The scholarship was modest, but it ensured that Emma's name would be spoken each year in a context of hope and achievement rather than tragedy and loss. The investigation file contained one piece of evidence that Lieutenant Chen returned to repeatedly: the testimony of Mrs. Patterson about the blue pickup truck. The teacher's description had never wavered over the years, and her certainty about what she had seen remained absolute. Yet David Morrison's alibi was equally solid, verified by multiple witnesses and corroborated by physical evidence. This contradiction lay at the heart of the case's unsolvable nature: two facts that appeared to be true but could not coexist logically. As 2019 turned to 2020 and then to 2021, the Morrison case remained in Lieutenant Chen's active files, even as she prepared for retirement. She had trained her replacement, Detective Amanda Williams, in the details of the case and had impressed upon her the importance of continuing to follow up on any new leads. But both women understood that after more than 2 decades, the likelihood of solving the case was remote. The COVID-19 pandemic brought new challenges to the Morrison family, as it did to everyone. Sarah Morrison worked extra shifts at the hospital, caring for patients in ways that reminded her daily of life's fragility and preciousness. Michael Morrison's hardware store was deemed essential, and he spent the pandemic helping neighbors with home repairs and improvements that kept them occupied during lockdowns. The isolation of the pandemic years was particularly difficult for them, as they had learned to rely on community connections and routine social interactions to help them manage their grief. By 2022, 23 years after Emma's disappearance, the case had achieved a kind of stability in its unsolved state. The investigation remained officially open, but new leads were extremely rare. The Morrison family had built meaningful lives around their loss, creating purpose from pain and finding ways to honor their daughter's memory while continuing to live their own lives. They had never stopped hoping for answers, but they had learned to live without them. The truth about what had happened to Emma Morrison seemed destined to remain forever hidden, buried in those 43 minutes on October 15, 1999, when a 7-year-old girl had climbed into a blue pickup truck and vanished from the world. But truth, like grief, has its own timeline, and sometimes the answers that seem lost forever have simply been waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. That moment was about to arrive in the most unexpected way possible, hidden in the dusty corners of an attic that no one had thoroughly searched in more than 2 decades. The summer of 2022 brought an unexpected change to the Morrison household. Sarah's elderly aunt, Margaret, who had lived alone in the family's ancestral home just outside Millbrook, suffered a stroke that left her unable to care for herself. The decision to move Margaret into assisted living meant that someone needed to clean out the Victorian house, where 3 generations of Sarah's family had lived, loved, and accumulated the detritus of nearly a century of life. The house on Elm Street had always felt like a museum to Sarah, filled with furniture that was too good to use and memories that were too precious to disturb. Aunt Margaret had been the family's unofficial historian, keeping photo albums, letters, and documents that traced the Morrison family lineage back to the early 1900s. Now, at 73, Sarah found herself tasked with sorting through decades of accumulated possessions and deciding what should be preserved, donated, or discarded. Michael took vacation time from the hardware store to help with the massive undertaking. They worked methodically, room by room, boxing items for charity and setting aside anything that might have sentimental or historical value. The process was both exhausting and oddly therapeutic, providing a distraction from their usual routines and a chance to connect with family history that had nothing to do with loss or tragedy. The attic had been saved for last, partly because it required climbing a steep, narrow staircase that was challenging for people in their 50s, and partly because Aunt Margaret had warned them that it was filled with everything that didn't have a proper place anywhere else. The space was cramped and dusty, with exposed beams and a single window that provided minimal light. Boxes were stacked along the walls, and furniture covered with sheets created shadowy forms that looked almost ghostly in the dim illumination. Sarah had climbed into the attic first, wearing old clothes and carrying a flashlight to supplement the weak overhead bulb. The air was thick with dust and the scent of old wood and mothballs. She began by moving the smaller boxes toward the access opening, where Michael could carry them down to be sorted through in the more comfortable living room below. Most of the containers held Christmas decorations, old clothing, and books that were too worn to be kept but too meaningful to be thrown away during their owners' lifetimes. One box, pushed far back under the eaves, proved to be heavier than its size suggested. Sarah had to crawl on her hands and knees to reach it, and when she pulled it toward her, she could hear objects shifting inside with the distinctive sound of plastic against cardboard. The box was unmarked except for David's room, written in faded blue ink on one side. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she recognized her late father-in-law's handwriting. The box contained items from David Morrison's childhood bedroom: packed away years earlier when he had moved out of his parents' house. There were model airplanes, baseball cards, school yearbooks, and other artifacts of a 1980s adolescence. But at the bottom of the box, wrapped in an old towel, Sarah found something that made her heart stop. A toy horse that looked exactly like Emma's beloved Buttercup. Sarah's hands trembled as she unwrapped the toy, examining it closely in the beam of her flashlight. The horse was the same size and color as the one Emma had carried everywhere, but this one showed signs of age and wear that were different from what she remembered. The mane was slightly faded, and there were small scratches on the surface that didn't match her memories of Emma's toy. But most significantly, this horse had something that Emma's Buttercup had never possessed: a small compartment in the belly that could be opened by pressing a hidden button. Inside the compartment, Sarah found a tiny rolled piece of paper, yellowed with age. Her hands shook as she carefully unrolled it, revealing a child's handwriting in purple crayon. Emma M., October 15th, 1999. Uncle David said this is our secret. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, and she had to steady herself against the attic beam to keep from falling. After 23 years of wondering, of hoping, of living with the terrible uncertainty of not knowing, she was holding evidence that might finally reveal the truth about what had happened to her daughter. "Michael!" she called, her voice cracking with emotion. "Michael, come up here right now." She could hear him climbing the stairs, his footsteps urgent on the wooden rungs. When his head appeared through the opening, she held up the toy horse and the piece of paper, unable to form words that could adequately explain what she had discovered. Michael's face went pale as he recognized the significance of what Sarah was holding. He climbed fully into the attic and moved carefully toward her, his own hands shaking as he examined the toy and read the note. The implications were staggering and horrifying. If this toy had belonged to Emma, if she had written this note, then David Morrison, his own brother, had been involved in her disappearance in ways that had never been suspected or investigated. The hidden compartment explained why this toy looked so similar to Emma's Buttercup. It was Buttercup, or rather, it was the original toy that David had given Emma for her 6th birthday. But this version had features that the toy Emma carried to school that day had not possessed. Someone had deliberately given Emma a different toy, one without the secret compartment, while keeping the original hidden away. Sarah and Michael sat in the attic for nearly an hour, holding the toy and the note, trying to process what they had discovered. The evidence suggested a premeditation that was more chilling than any random act of violence could have been. If David had deliberately given Emma a replica of her favorite toy while keeping the original, it implied planning and deception that stretched back months or even years before the disappearance. The note itself raised even more disturbing questions. The reference to our secret suggested that Emma had been aware of some kind of special relationship or arrangement with her uncle. The date, October 15th, 1999, was the day she had disappeared. Had Emma written this note on the morning of her disappearance? Had David somehow convinced her to participate in what she thought was a game or adventure? Michael's first instinct was to call Lieutenant Chen immediately, but Sarah insisted they think carefully about how to proceed. After 23 years of believing that David had been cleared of any involvement in Emma's disappearance, this discovery would require them to reconsider everything they thought they knew about that day. The implications for their family, for David's life and for the investigation were enormous. They climbed down from the attic carefully, carrying the box and its contents. In the brighter light of the living room, they examined the toy more thoroughly. The craftsmanship of the hidden compartment was sophisticated, suggesting it was an original feature rather than something that had been added later. The paper inside showed signs of age, consistent with having been written 23 years earlier. The handwriting appeared to match samples of Emma's writing that they had saved from her schoolwork. Sarah called in sick to work the next day, something she had rarely done in her nursing career. She and Michael spent hours discussing how to handle their discovery, weighing their responsibility to pursue the truth against their fear of what that truth might reveal. David was still alive, still living in Pittsburgh, still part of their extended family despite the distance that had grown between them over the years. The decision to contact law enforcement was ultimately inevitable. Lieutenant Chen, now retired but still living in the area, agreed to meet with them at their home rather than at the police station. When she saw the toy horse and read the note, her reaction was immediate and professional. She photographed the evidence, documented its discovery, and began making phone calls to reactivate the investigation that had been dormant for so many years. The discovery in Aunt Margaret's attic would prove to be the break that investigators had been hoping for since 1999, but it would also raise new questions that were even more disturbing than the original mystery. If David Morrison had been involved in Emma's disappearance, how had he managed to fool investigators for so long? What had really happened during those 43 minutes on October 15th? And most importantly, where was Emma Morrison now? The toy horse, with its hidden compartment and secret note, had finally broken the silence of 23 years, but the truth it revealed would prove to be more complex and heartbreaking than anyone could have imagined. The investigation that had seemed closed forever was about to begin again, guided by evidence that had been hidden in plain sight all along. Lieutenant Chen's hands were steadier now than they had been on that morning in 1999 when she first interviewed David Morrison, but her mind raced with the same intensity that had driven her through decades of police work. The toy horse sat on the Morrison family's dining room table like an accusation, its hidden compartment open to reveal the devastating secret it had protected for 23 years. Chen photographed the evidence from every angle, her training taking over even as her heart broke for the family whose world was about to be shattered once again. The reactivation of the Emma Morrison case required delicate coordination between multiple agencies. Detective Amanda Williams, who had inherited the case file from Chen, was called in immediately. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was contacted, and agents who specialized in cold cases were dispatched from Philadelphia. The Pennsylvania State Police assigned a new task force to the investigation, understanding that the discovery of new evidence would generate intense media attention and public scrutiny. The first step was to locate David Morrison in Pittsburgh and place him under surveillance, while investigators developed a strategy for approaching him. David was now 55 years old, working as a maintenance supervisor at a large automotive repair facility and living alone in a modest apartment in the Brookline neighborhood. He had no criminal record beyond traffic violations, and his employers described him as reliable but withdrawn, the kind of worker who showed up on time, did his job competently, and rarely socialized with colleagues. The handwriting analysis of Emma's note was expedited through the state crime lab, where experts compared it to samples of her schoolwork that had been preserved in the original case file. The preliminary results confirmed what the Morrison family already knew. The handwriting was consistent with Emma's, and the purple crayon matched crayons that had been found in her bedroom after her disappearance. More sophisticated analysis would take weeks, but the initial findings supported the authenticity of the note. Detective Williams worked with federal agents to develop an interrogation strategy that would maximize the chances of getting truthful information from David Morrison. After 23 years, any physical evidence related to Emma's disappearance had likely been destroyed or degraded beyond usefulness. Their best hope for learning what had happened to Emma lay in convincing David to confess, assuming he was indeed responsible for her disappearance. The psychological profile developed for David Morrison painted a picture of a man who had carried enormous guilt and stress for more than 2 decades. FBI analysts noted that his move away from Millbrook, his failed marriage, and his isolated lifestyle were all consistent with someone living with a terrible secret. They recommended an approach that emphasized the relief that could come from finally telling the truth, rather than one that focused on punishment or consequences. On August 15, 2022, exactly 23 years and 10 months after Emma's disappearance, David Morrison was arrested at his workplace in Pittsburgh. The arrest was conducted quietly, without media notification, to give investigators the best chance of obtaining a confession before the case became public knowledge. David was read his rights and transported to a Pennsylvania State Police facility, where he was questioned by Detective Williams and FBI agent Sarah Kowalski. The interrogation began with David being shown photographs of the toy horse and Emma's note. His reaction was immediate and devastating. He broke down completely, sobbing with an intensity that suggested 23 years of suppressed guilt and anguish. But even in his emotional state, David initially denied any involvement in Emma's disappearance, claiming that he had never seen the toy before and had no idea how it had ended up in his childhood possessions. The questioning continued for 6 hours, with breaks for David to consult with a court-appointed attorney. Investigators presented the evidence methodically, walking David through the timeline of October 15, 1999, and pointing out the inconsistencies in his original story. They showed him the note in Emma's handwriting, which referenced him by name and mentioned their secret. They explained how the toy had been found in a box labeled with his name, in a family attic that only relatives would have had access to. Finally, faced with evidence that seemed impossible to refute, David Morrison began to tell the truth about what had happened on that October afternoon 23 years earlier. His confession was halting and interrupted by tears, but it gradually revealed a story that was both more and less sinister than investigators had imagined. David admitted that he had been at the school earlier than he had originally claimed. He had arrived around 3:30 p.m., intending to pick up Emma as planned, but he had seen something that changed everything. According to his confession, he had witnessed a man approaching Emma at the flagpole, talking to her, and eventually convincing her to get into a blue pickup truck that looked very similar to David's own vehicle. David claimed that he had followed the truck, staying far enough behind to avoid being noticed, but close enough to see where Emma was being taken. The vehicle had traveled to a remote area outside Millbrook, where David said he had witnessed Emma being transferred to a different car. He claimed that he had tried to intervene, but had been threatened by the abductor, who had warned him that Emma would be killed if he contacted police or told anyone what he had seen. According to David's confession, the abductor had demanded that David provide an alibi for the time of Emma's disappearance, threatening to harm Emma if he revealed the truth. David claimed that he had been forced to lie to investigators, maintaining that he had never seen Emma that day, while secretly hoping that she would be returned unharmed. He said that the toy horse had been given to him by the abductor as proof that Emma was still alive, along with instructions to keep it hidden as insurance against David, revealing the truth. The confession was detailed and emotionally convincing, but investigators immediately recognized several problems with David's story. The timeline didn't match the established facts of the case, particularly Mrs. Patterson's testimony about seeing Emma get into a blue pickup truck at 3:45 p.m. David's description of the abductor was vague and generic, and he claimed to have no knowledge of the man's identity or motives. Most significantly, he could provide no explanation for why Emma had written the note found in the toy horse, particularly the reference to Uncle David and their secret. Agent Kowalski pressed David on these inconsistencies, pointing out that his story required them to believe that a random abductor had not only taken Emma, but had also involved David in an elaborate cover-up scheme. She noted that the toy horse suggested premeditation and a personal connection to Emma, not the random opportunistic crime that David was describing. Under continued questioning, David's story began to change. He admitted that his relationship with Emma had been special and that he had been giving her gifts and spending extra time with her in the months before her disappearance. He acknowledged that the toy horse had indeed been a gift from him, and that the hidden compartment had been something he had shown Emma as a way of making her feel special and grown up. But David continued to maintain that he had not harmed Emma, and that he did not know what had ultimately happened to her. He claimed that his lies to investigators had been motivated by fear and confusion, not by guilt over his own actions. He insisted that he had genuinely believed that telling the truth would put Emma in greater danger. The interrogation was suspended after 12 hours, with David being held pending further investigation. Investigators now faced the challenge of determining whether David's confession represented the truth, a partial truth, or another layer of deception designed to minimize his responsibility for Emma's disappearance. The discovery of the toy horse had broken the case open, but it had also raised new questions that would require careful investigation to answer. The Morrison family was notified of David's arrest and confession, though they were not provided with the full details of his statement. Sarah and Michael Morrison found themselves confronting the possibility that David, the brother and uncle they had loved and trusted, had been involved in Emma's disappearance all along. The betrayal was almost as devastating as the original loss, forcing them to question their memories of that terrible day and their understanding of the man they had thought they knew. The investigation now focused on corroborating or disproving David's confession, searching for physical evidence that might support his claims about witnessing Emma's abduction by an unknown third party. But investigators also began looking more closely at David's life in the months and years following Emma's disappearance, searching for signs that he had been living with the guilt of having harmed his own niece. The truth about what had happened to Emma Morrison was finally beginning to emerge, but it was proving to be more complex and painful than anyone had anticipated. The toy horse had kept its secret for 23 years, and now that secret was revealing a story of family betrayal, hidden guilt, and a mystery that might never be fully resolved. David Morrison sat in the sterile interview room, his hands clasped so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. 23 years of carrying his secret had aged him beyond his 55 years, and the fluorescent lighting cast harsh shadows across his gaunt face. Detective Williams and Agent Kowalski had returned for a second day of questioning, armed with new evidence that had emerged from the forensic analysis of the toy horse and a more thorough search of David's apartment in Pittsburgh. The breakthrough had come from an unexpected source. While searching David's apartment, investigators had discovered a small storage unit rented under a false name, but paid for with money orders that could be traced back to David through security camera footage. Inside the unit, they had found Emma's backpack, her school clothes from October 15, 1999, and most devastatingly, a journal that David had kept for over 2 decades, documenting his guilt and his memories of that terrible day. The journal entries revealed a story that was both simpler and more tragic than the elaborate conspiracy David had described in his initial confession. The truth was that David Morrison had indeed picked up Emma from school that day, but what had happened next was not the calculated crime that investigators had imagined. Instead, it was a series of decisions made by a man who was overwhelmed by circumstances he couldn't control and terrified of consequences he couldn't face. According to the journal entries, David had arrived at the school on time and had picked up Emma as planned. She had been excited to spend the afternoon with him, chattering about her Halloween costume and the upcoming school party. They had driven toward David's apartment, but Emma had asked if they could stop at the pet store to look at the puppies, something David had promised her they could do sometime. He had agreed, thinking it would make her happy and give them something fun to do together. At the pet store, Emma had become fascinated with a litter of golden retriever puppies. She had played with them for over an hour, laughing and asking David if they could adopt one. He had explained that her parents would need to make that decision, but Emma had become increasingly upset at the idea of leaving the puppies behind. She had begun crying, then had what David described as a meltdown, the kind of emotional outburst that 7-year-old children sometimes have when they're tired or overwhelmed. David, who had little experience dealing with children's emotions, had panicked. He had tried to comfort Emma, but she had become inconsolable, crying loudly and attracting attention from other customers and store employees. Embarrassed and afraid that someone might think he was harming her, David had picked Emma up and carried her out of the store, despite her protests and continued crying. In the parking lot, Emma had calmed down slightly, but she was still upset and asking to go back inside to see the puppies. David had tried to explain that they needed to go home, but Emma had suddenly announced that she wanted to go to her real home and asked why they weren't driving toward her house. This innocent question had triggered something in David's mind, a sudden fear that Emma might tell her parents about the pet store incident and that they might think he had done something inappropriate. The journal entries became increasingly difficult to read as David described what happened next. In his panic and confusion, he had made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Instead of taking Emma home and explaining the pet store incident to her parents, he had decided to drive to a remote area outside Millbrook, where he could think about what to do. He had convinced Emma that they were taking a different route home, and she had trusted him completely. In the wooded area where David had taken Emma, the 7-year-old had begun to ask more questions about why they weren't going home. She had become frightened when she realized that they were in an unfamiliar place, and she had started crying again and asking for her mother. David's journal entries described his growing panic as he realized that he had made everything worse by bringing Emma to this isolated location. What happened next, according to David's journal, was the result of his complete emotional breakdown. He had tried to calm Emma down, but his own agitation had frightened her even more. She had tried to run away from him, and in his attempt to stop her, he had grabbed her arm too roughly. Emma had fallen, hitting her head on a rock, and had lost consciousness immediately. David's journal described the terrible moments that followed. He had tried to wake Emma up, but she hadn't responded. He had no medical training and was too panicked to think clearly about what to do. He had convinced himself that Emma was dead, and his terror about the consequences had led him to make another devastating decision. Instead of calling for help or taking Emma to a hospital, he had hidden her body in the woods and had driven home to begin the elaborate lie that he would maintain for 23 years. The journal entries revealed that Emma had not actually died from her fall. David's later entries, written years after the incident, showed that he had eventually realized his mistake. Emma had likely been unconscious but alive when he left her in the woods, and she had probably died from exposure and dehydration rather than from her injury. This realization had tortured David for decades, as he understood that his panic and poor decisions had cost Emma her life when she might have been saved. The location where David had left Emma was described in detail in his journal, along with crude maps and landmark descriptions that he had apparently used to return to the site multiple times over the years. Search teams were dispatched immediately, and within hours they had found Emma's remains in a shallow grave in a remote section of state forest about 15 miles from Millbrook. The skeletal remains were consistent with those of a 7-year-old child, and preliminary examination confirmed the presence of a head injury that matched David's description. The discovery of Emma's body brought both closure and renewed anguish to her family. After 23 years of wondering and hoping, they finally knew what had happened to their daughter. But the truth was more heartbreaking than any scenario they had imagined. Emma had died not because of a predator or stranger, but because of a series of panicked decisions made by someone who had loved her and whom she had trusted completely. David Morrison was charged with involuntary manslaughter and concealing a death. His attorney argued that the original incident had been a tragic accident, and that David's subsequent actions, while wrong, had been motivated by panic and fear rather than criminal intent. The prosecution maintained that David's decision to hide Emma's body and lie to investigators for 23 years demonstrated a callous disregard for the family's suffering and the resources devoted to searching for her. The trial, when it came, was brief and largely procedural. David pleaded guilty to all charges, expressing remorse for his actions and finally providing investigators with complete details about Emma's final hours. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 10 years. The judge noted that while David's original actions might have been the result of panic and poor judgment, his decision to maintain his lie for over 2 decades had caused immeasurable additional suffering to Emma's family. Sarah and Michael Morrison attended David's sentencing, sitting in the front row of the courtroom as the man they had once considered a beloved family member was led away in handcuffs. They had prepared victim impact statements, but when the time came to read them, neither could find words adequate to express their feelings of betrayal, loss, and grief. Emma Catherine Morrison was finally laid to rest in October 2022, 23 years after her disappearance. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, including many who had searched for her in 1999 and had never forgotten her story. Lieutenant Chen, now retired, served as an honorary pallbearer, fulfilling her promise to Emma's family that their daughter would never be forgotten. The toy horse that had finally revealed the truth about Emma's disappearance was buried with her, along with letters from her parents and other mementos that had been saved over the years. The hidden compartment that had concealed Emma's note for so long was left open, symbolizing the end of secrets and the beginning of a different kind of healing for the Morrison family. In the months that followed, Sarah and Michael Morrison worked with victim services organizations to help other families dealing with missing children cases. They spoke about the importance of never giving up hope while also learning to live with uncertainty. They established a foundation in Emma's memory that provided support for families of missing children and funded training for law enforcement officers working on such cases. The house on Sycamore Street was finally changed after Emma's funeral. Her bedroom was converted into a small library and meditation space, filled with books about healing and hope. The toy horses that had sat in their semicircle for 23 years were donated to the local children's hospital, where they could bring comfort to other young patients. The story of Emma Morrison's disappearance and the 23-year search for truth had finally come to an end. But like all stories of profound loss and eventual resolution, it left behind questions about the nature of family, trust, and the terrible consequences that can result from moments of panic and poor judgment. Emma's memory would live on not just in the hearts of those who had loved her, but in the lives of other missing children who might be found because of the lessons learned from her case. The broken toy in the attic had finally revealed its secret, bringing an end to one of Pennsylvania's longest unsolved missing children cases. The truth, when it finally emerged, was both simpler and more complex than anyone had imagined, a reminder that sometimes the most devastating mysteries are hidden not in elaborate conspiracies or criminal masterminds, but in the very human failings of ordinary people who make terrible decisions in moments of fear and confusion. What would you have done in that moment of discovery? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Sometimes the most important conversations start with the hardest questions we're brave enough to ask.